gets quiet, you're supposed to begin. Good evening. My name is Cynthia Lindner. I am the director of the MDiv program here at the University of Chicago Divinity School. And so on behalf of the faculty and the students and the staff that comprise our learning community that is the Divinity School at the University of Chicago, I'm delighted to welcome you to our home in Swift Hall. There's a couple things you might want to know about our home in Swift Hall. And one of them is, where's the restroom, right? So if you haven't yet found that, there's a single user restroom at the back of the foyer if you're walking into it on the left-hand side in the hallway. Or if you would like, there's a women's room and a men's room downstairs in the lower level, also called the basement, because it looks like one. And if you go down there, you're going to go to the right in the foyer and you'll find the steps going down. Okay? So that's logistics. But let me just say that I am really excited to see the faces in this room today for the opening lecture of this conference of the International Association for Spiritual Care, a conference that we've named Spiritual Care as Resistance. For obvious reasons. The resistance starts with all of you being in this place, in this moment, in this time, and already your faces here fill me with inspiration and courage and hope. So thank you for being here tonight. To my colleagues in this association that I've met over several years at these conferences, a special welcome to all of you. While you all might not have been in this building before, I assure you that your names are on some bibliographies in this building. Some of you have been spoken about and cited in the classrooms in this building. I'm looking at all of you now. So it's a delight to have you here in this space. Consider it your space because we talk about you all the time. And thank you for what you do to enrich our teaching and learning in this place. And if you are a student, or an alum, hello now. If you are a student or an alum or a clergy person or a chaplain, this is your conversation. This is your community. You are spiritual care, and we could not be thinking about and talking about what we do if it weren't for you. So thank you for being here and joining your voices in the conversation. You will notice that none of you were given a name tag this evening. That was on purpose. And the purpose is when you go to the reception, which we will do at 8 o'clock when this part of the program is finished, you will introduce yourselves all around, okay? Nobody's gonna look at your chest or your belly button to see what your name is. You're gonna have to actually go up and meet people and tell them who you are and give each other a warm welcome. We're all colleagues in this place. I'm glad that you are joining us today. I'm gonna turn this microphone over briefly to our president. You're the president, right, Tim? The president.
Excellency would be.
We are in the presence of royalty tonight, people. This is Daniel Shipani, and Daniel is going to tell us more about the association and the conference, and he's going to introduce our speaker for the evening. So Daniel, welcome.
Good evening, and thank you so much, Cynthia, for that hospitable welcome words in this beautiful place, this wonderful campus in lovely Hyde Park. I love Hyde Park, with all its buildings and the lake and the institutions. On behalf of the board of the International Association for Spiritual Care and the committee, the program committee, I offer a few words here, briefly, as I was told. The International Association for Spiritual Care has the aim to foster interfaith, intercultural, and international exchange in the fields of research and practice in spiritual care, And its members are researchers, practitioners, educators, and other interested parties who are involved in spiritual care. It was inaugurated in 2015 at the University of Bern in Switzerland, and the mission statement at that point included this commitment to enhance the capacities of scholars and practitioners worldwide in acquiring, disseminating, applying knowledge of theory and practice of spiritual care with an emphasis on interdisciplinary, interreligious, and intercultural scholarly investigation. Annual conferences have been held in Bern twice, Jerusalem and Beit Hallel, New York City, and Tübingen. Focus topics included pastoral care across religions and cultures, migration, peace dialogue as spiritual care, religious conflicts, internal and external. And during the COVID pandemic, 2 conferences were held online. And last September, we had an online symposium also, Practical Theologies, Wisdom Traditions in Spiritual Care. Our association also collaborates with the Society for Intercultural and Interreligious Pastoral Care and Counseling, whose 30th anniversary will be celebrated in October. October last year, October this year, sorry, will contribute to that celebration. I want to say that this is today just the start of this annual conference. Tomorrow and Tuesday, don't come here to go to CTU, Catholic Theological Union, where the rest of the sessions will be held. Our distinguished speaker this morning was one of the founding members of the International Association of Spiritual Care. And under Pam's leadership, a number of good things happened in addition to the conferences that we held, a number of writing projects. Reverend Dr. Pamela Cooper-White is the Dean Vice President for Academic Affairs Emerita, and the Christiane Brooks Johnson, Professor Emerita of Psychology and Religion at Union Theological Seminary. She has published 10 books and more than 100 anthology chapters and articles. Book titles include All Under God's Religion, Anti-Semitism, and the Origins of Psychoanalysis. Many Voices, Pastoral Psychotherapy in Relational and Theological Perspective. The Cry of Tamar, Violence Against Women and the Church's Responses. And I wish to highlight 3 now in particular. The Psychology of Christian here, nationalism, and also recently the 20th anniversary expanded edition of a classic that we all must have, Share Wisdom, Use of the Self in Pastoral Care and Counseling. And just released with the contributions of a number of members of the association, What is Spiritual Care? Perspective from diverse religious traditions and disciplines. A copy of those 3 books so that you can have a chance to browse if you wish. During the conference, there will be a table with some of these books. We cannot sell them. We will give them away in exchange for a donation from you. I happen to be a naturalized US citizen, so I'm very much aware I should not trespass because and I grew up under a fascist regime in Argentina, by the way. So, with the police state, one must not trespass, especially if one is an alien. Anyway, I want to also add, however, sorry for the break, the parenthesis there, that in addition to the presidency here, the association, Pam has served as co-chair of the Psychology, Culture, and Religion under the American Academy of Religion, and as editor of the Journal of Pastoral Theology. Pam is an Episcopal priest, licensed and board-certified clinical counselor, psychoanalytically trained pastoral psychotherapist, and has lectured frequently in the United States and internationally. We look forward to your lecture, Pam. Thank you so much for being with us.
And I owe a great debt of gratitude to Dan for taking over the presidency of IASC when I was ready to retire from Union, and I was so happy to have the organization in such capable hands. So thank you, Dan. Thank you, Cynthia, for welcoming us to this esteemed institution tonight. And thanks to all of you for being here, many familiar faces from far and near, and looking forward to all of our conversations over the next couple of days as well. So, this is the only time I've started with this sentence, but I may keep it. This is probably the angriest talk I've ever given. US President Donald Trump and his loyalists have taken a wrecking ball to virtually everything touching on racial, gender, and climate justice that most, if not all of us here, have worked on for decades. And the consequences are dire and potentially long-lasting. This program of extreme right-wing takeover of every aspect of government and society is, frankly, murderous. As just one example, the dismantling of USAID is not, as advertised, a streamlining of budgets, or even a turn toward America First isolationism. It is, in reality, a genocidal act, causing mass starvation and uncontrolled disease. No need to declare war, it immediately became possible to kill millions of black and brown people in the Southern Hemisphere and in the US without firing a single bullet. And we're already seeing the devastating fallout, both for those who have worked and taught at all levels of society, and for those who are most vulnerable, the poor, the marginalized, BIPOC and LGBTQ persons, oppressed women and children, refugees and immigrants, the elderly and persons with disabilities, and persons whose very lives are at stake as fires, storms, floods like what we just witnessed in the Texas Hill Country, and rising sea levels threaten increasing so-called natural disasters. We hear the earth screaming at us through ice and tornadoes, in fire, mudslides, floods, earthquakes, and tsunamis. As many of you know, my most recent book was a research project into the psychology of Christian nationalism, the belief system it represents,
its allure for people we might consider to be good people, and how to talk across the divide, this increasingly polarized American political divide. As spiritual care providers, chaplains, and pastoral counselors, we have a particular vested interest in understanding this movement, not only because it has national and international implications for all those whom we serve, both in the US and abroad, but also where similar movements, such as the Fidesz party in Hungary and various right-wing parties across Europe and beyond, justify their authoritarianism with references to homeland, ethnic purity, and yes, traditional religious homogeneity. As the Christian right in the United States has become increasingly fused with the MAGA, Make America Great Again movement, I want to spend some time reviewing what we know about Christian nationalism and then describing its infusion into American politics today. And I want to just make a note. I'm using the word American as shorthand, but I understand that there's another America, which is South America, Central America, and also Canada, and I don't want to make it sound like I think that we're all of it, even though Trump would like to annex much of it. So those of you today who are not US citizens may find parallels with similar movements in your own countries, as well as the serious repercussions of the tidal wave of new policies coming from the US president and Congress, which made it actually difficult or impossible for some of our members even to be here in person with us tonight. And we're very grateful for those who are either going to see this through a recording or through streaming the next couple of days and still can participate with us. On January 6th, 2021, as we know all too well by now, a violent mob attacked the US Capitol in a shocking effort to stop the certification of the election of Joe Biden as president. Why do I continue to show these images several years later? I want to counter the false MAGA narrative that this was a day of love. We need to remember it was a day of violence. Deep in the midst of this mob was a loose-knit band of religiously motivated individuals who see themselves as devout Christians. On display among the crowds during the attack on the Capitol were numerous flags and signs with "Jesus Saves" in bold letters and other Christian symbols proudly displayed alongside numerous blatantly racist ones, including a Confederate flag paraded through the halls of Congress. One photo that went viral showed a group of men before an, 8, 9, 10-foot high cross, one with his forehead pressed against it in apparent fervent prayer. One group among the mob called themselves a Jericho March, Christians blowing shofars, a blasphemous use of this sacred Jewish symbol, praying to bring down the walls of government. A common belief among Christian nationalists is that there has been a woeful decline of America's standing in the world because of the supposed nation's growing degeneracy, and with it the concomitant belief in an urgent call to restore the nation to its original goodness, and a mandate to lead the world in godliness. Therefore, God has withdrawn his blessing from America because, like the ancient Israelites, she, America, has fallen into profligacy and a violation of God's laws. The United States was founded, according to this group, by evangelical Christians, all of them, based on a misreading of the more complex history of the framers of the Constitution. Just think of Jefferson, but many others. There was no theological homogeneity among them. Christian nationalists believe that they had God's special mandate to become a new Jerusalem in which white Christians, mostly male, at that time entirely male, will rule over a nation whose laws are perfectly aligned with their own selective fundamentalist reading of biblical mandates. In their interpretation of apocalyptic scripture, many, especially a wing of Christian nationalism called dominionism, or dominionists, see an avenging Jesus coming to wage spiritual warfare against the current decadent ways of America and the world. Those who hold such views see a growing depravity of the current age as evidence that the end of times is near, and it is their duty to help bring it about. The main tenets of Christian nationalism are that God established the United States as a Christian nation, and therefore should essentially be a theonomy, rule of laws, shaped by Christian values, as interpreted under an alliance of conservative Christian leaders and right-wing political activists, and a theocracy, ruled by religious leadership, characterized by the headship of men over their households and white male leadership in the public sphere. Christian nationalist preachers exhort the faithful in sermon and song to take this nation back, even by force if required. I believe we are and have been at a pivotal moment for a while now in the American experiment of democracy, and also in the very character of American Christianity. Now the urgency of this moment is becoming ever more clear. The very term Christian nationalism really means white nationalism and stands opposed to virtually everything taught in Christianity, Judaism, or Islam about justice and compassion. Christian nationalists therefore oppose the separation of church and state, rather advocating for the display of Christian symbols in public spaces. And I realize the Ten Commandments come from the Hebrew Bible, but they're always being appropriated as a Christian symbol in this context. And explicitly Christian prayer in schools and civic gatherings. In a recent ethnographic study of instances of prayer within Christian nationalist events, quote, particularly in the context of violent protests and contentious political mobilizations, John Day, director of the Democracy Initiative at Notre Dame University, draws on Pierre Bourdieu's concept of symbolic capital and practice theory to argue that, quote, prayer functions not merely as an expression of faith, as a performative mechanism that organizes bodies, structures political space, and sacralizes political grievances. Prayer operates as a disciplinary tool that consolidates group identity, legitimizes leaders, and marks in-group and out-group boundaries. Rather than de-escalating conflict, prayer functions to intensify political struggle by framing it as a divinely mandated battle, lowering the moral barriers to violence and embedding political aggression within a sacred framework. By sacralizing nationalist objectives and providing ritualized legitimacy to militant action, prayer becomes a critical technology of power in Christian nationalist mobilization. End of quote. Donald Trump's head of the Department of Defense, Pete Hegseth, wrote in his book, American Crusade, that, quote, people who enjoy the benefits of Western civilization should thank a crusader. We don't want to fight, but like our fellow Christians 1,000 years ago, we must. On his own arm, he displays a tattoo of the Crusaders' battle cry, Deus vult, God wills it, over the word kafir in Arabic, meaning infidel, and several other similar images. Now I want to note here, close to the beginning of my talk, that Black church Protestants also do align Christian values with politics, but to gospel-grounded social and political action for change, whereas white Christian nationalist agenda is almost entirely opposed to what we would consider social justice. Right-wing extremism has been percolating in the United States for a long time, probably in some form or another since its birth. You see the images of revivalism and images from The Birth of a Nation, which was very, whipped up a lot of racist fervor around the time of the Civil War. With its current wave originating in the 1960s as a backlash to the civil rights and women's movements, and becoming more visible during the Reagan era with his alliance with evangelical preachers such as Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell Sr., who founded the so-called moral majority movement. We're now seeing this playing out in the ultra-conservative Heritage Foundation's 900-page Project 2025, a sweeping blueprint for the implementation of an authoritarian government created by a large team of alt-right and Christian nationalist scholars, including many of Trump's current political appointees. Among its many authoritarian aims, Project 2025's explicitly right-wing Christian goals include comprehensively controlling women's reproductive rights, enforcing a, quote, biblically based and so-called social science reinforced definition of marriage and family, which we are now seeing blended with a natalist drive to have more, presumably white Christian babies. Rescinding federal protections for LGBTQ plus people, diverting funding from public schools to religious schools, encouraging Christian indoctrination in public schools, and otherwise endeavoring to control education from pre-K to graduate education in an authoritarian move to indoctrinate, to quash dissent, and in general to weaken critical thinking. Other elements of Project 2025 do not explicitly invoke religious justification, but they reinforce the authoritarian playbook by aggrandizing executive power, weakening checks and balances in governments, attempting to politicize independent institutions, scapegoating vulnerable communities, and quashing dissent. And there actually is Project Protect Democracy 2022 has an online authoritarian playbook that spells out the ways in which authoritarianism can develop anywhere. The Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, and others in Congress belong to the extremist New Apostolic Reformation, and an organization called Christ for the Nations posted a sign at its annual conference reading, "Everyone ought to pray at least one violent prayer each day," expressing an overt desire for Christians to overthrow the government. Are you scared yet? Lest we conclude that Christian nationalism is a fringe movement involving only a small percentage of American Christians, statistics show, this is the most recent that we have, about 1/3 of Americans, so the orange and the yellow there, are either strong adherents or sympathizers with Christian nationalist beliefs, making up about 1/3 of Americans. Another 37% of skeptics, down here in the green, these are probably the ones who are most persuadable to become rejectors, and rejectors are currently at 29%. These are the statements that the most recent survey by the Public Religion Research Institute, PRI, put out for people. This is how they came to those statistics. You either agree or disagree with these statements. The US government should declare America a Christian nation. Declare it, not just even be it. The US law should be based on Christian values. If the US moves away from our Christian foundations, we will not have a country anymore. Being Christian is an important part of being truly American. God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of American society. About 2/3 of Christian nationalist adherents and sympathizers agree that immigrants, quote, are invading our country and replacing our cultural and ethnic background, and are poisoning the blood of our country. And that's twice the number of sympathizers and 8 times the number of rejectors. Nearly 4 in 10 Christian nationalism adherents and 3 in 10 sympathizers agree that because things have gotten so far off track, true American patriots may have to resort to violence to save the country. And that compares with only 15% of skeptics and 7% of rejectors. 2/3 of adherents, 67%, and nearly half of sympathizers agree that God ordained Trump to win the presidential election. I'll come back to that in a moment. Many of those who witnessed the assassination attempt against Trump in Butler, Pennsylvania, see his survival as divine intervention and have circulated this image of an American flag twisted by the wind into what they see as the figure of a guardian angel. At the Republican National Convention, Tucker Carlson said that was a transformation. This was no longer a man. Among MAGA partisans, Trump now had a confirmed divine mandate to lead the nation. In another recent study, 60% of adherents and 37% of sympathizers agree with the statement, non-Christians create immoral policies. A vast publishing empire and online Christian family content, such as James Dobson's decades-old focus on the family, also promotes Christian nationalist ideas as part of its campaign to promote the traditional patriarchal family and to indoctrinate children into a melding of religion, right-wing patriotism, and a conservative, God-honoring definition of Christian life, family life. Even political rallies, including Trump's campaign events, are now awash in Christian nationalist prayer and so-called Christian music. And during his campaign, Trump began to have people starting with Bible readings and prayer at the very beginning of all of his rallies, and then again at the end. All of this follows numerous efforts over the past half-century to strategically infiltrate every aspect of civic and domestic life. How many of you have ever heard of the Seven Mountain Mandate? Okay. I had not, but apparently in evangelical circles it's very common. Popularized by Campus Crusade, which claims that Christians should have dominion over all of these areas: business, government, family, religion, media, education, and entertainment. That's pretty much everything. Let me be clear then. Christian nationalist rhetoric is a fanatical, radical departure from the teachings of Jesus and any faithful reading of either the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament, and it is also dangerously anti-democratic. My own definition, my working definition of Christian nationalism is that it is a distorted version of Christianity that all but ignores the gospel teachings of love, mercy, and justice, rather serving as a quasi-religious cover for white supremacy and patriarchal power. Now, my research as a scholar of psychology and religion has particularly addressed why and how people get hooked by demagogues and conspiracy theories, and the psychology behind people's vulnerability to being captivated by false teachings, both religious and political, and their personal investment in maintaining these beliefs. I've identified at least 4 conscious or pre-conscious motivations behind adherence to Christian nationalist ideas. And I'm going to go through these one by one, but these are the 4. Belonging with a sense of purpose, fear, fear, fear. Belonging. Evangelization that fulfills the need for belonging and a sense of purpose, heightened by the religious appeal to join in a cosmic battle of good versus evil, with tactics that are similar and at times nearly identical with cult recruiting. And I don't have time tonight to talk about the specifics of that, but in my book I actually did some research on cult recruiting and saw many parallels with what's going on. Secondly, fear of loss of white social status, resentment against a perceived, although still quite minimal statistically, loss of jobs and economic power to immigrants and people of color, and a desire to maintain or regain white supremacy and white power in the face of the reality that, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, the year 2042 will mark the end of a white majority population in the United States. For many of us, we regard such diversity as an enriching of our common life, but for those who perhaps their only sense of dignity has been associated with being white, this represents an existential threat. Christian nationalism therefore aligns with the Nazi Great Replacement theory, and at Charlottesville, white supremacists were marching with torches and shouted, "Jews will not replace us." Leaders stoke this fear by actually creating disruption of democratic institutions and invigorating a desire for more law and order, which is exactly the Nazi playbook. Another fear, the fear of loss of patriarchal authority and a masculinist hierarchy both in the home and in the public sphere of work and governmental power. And finally, paranoia. A feeling of loss of one's social moorings that can be attached to pseudo-claims of persecution, including the irrational fear of persecution of Christians in our time, which is very common in the rhetoric of Christian nationalists and evangelical Protestants in general, and the allure of conspiracy theories such as QAnon, whose beliefs are now adopted by as many as 1 in 5 Americans overall and 1/4 of evangelical Christians, exemplifying what historian Richard Hofstadter identified as a long-standing paranoid style in American politics. Now, this Jeffrey Epstein thing that's happening now is creating current controversy around conspiracies and counter-conspiracies within MAGA, and we'll see where it goes. So these 4 motivations are made explicit to varying degrees. Belonging, fear, fear, and fear. But they are conscious to the degree that adherents of Christian nationalism would agree to them, even if using different language to describe them. Turning to a more explicitly psychoanalytic perspective, unconscious motivations involve the insidious unconscious pulls of group psychology. And here I'm going back to Sigmund Freud's prescient analysis of groups in 1921 and parallels between Christian nationalism and the power of cult-like groups and their narcissistic leaders to make and amplify false claims, including the role of both mainstream and social media. I believe that Freud's group psychology is as relevant a description today as it was in his own time regarding the psychologically symbiotic bond between followers and their idealized patriarchal leaders, a symbiosis that psychologists have variously called mass hypnosis and mutual intoxication. Freud's breakthrough in 1921, on the heels of World War I, was to recognize the power of a narcissistic leader and the ways in which followers unconsciously hand over their individual consciences to a demagogue who, with simplistic moral directives and all good versus evil political rhetoric, promises to restore whatever is lacking in their lives. Such leaders exude a fusion of power and erotic potency that men can merge with at an unconscious psychic level, and women can admire. Okay, you can go, ugh, that's okay. How relevant is this to the rise of right-wing strongman leaders like Trump and the bloody dictators across the globe that he still emulates and praises? Well, things with Putin are not going so well right now. Freud was not the first psychologist to study groups and to recognize that when people join a group, they begin to participate in a social dynamic that transcends individual, particular attitudes, even to the point of sacrificing their own personal morality and capacity for critical thinking. Freud drew heavily in his group psychology on the late 19th century work of Gustave Le Bon, whose treatise, The Crowd, A Study of the Popular Mind, laid the foundations for the study of groups, especially mass movements. Le Bon's work, like Freud's, was prompted by experiences of war, in Le Bon's case, the Franco-Prussian War, and its devastating economic aftermath, including a short-lived anti-authoritarian revolt in Paris in the 1870s. Le Bon identified what he called a collective mind that takes over members of a group, and which can even give permission to individuals, as quoted by Freud, to, quote, feel, think, and act in a manner quite different from that in which each individual of them would feel, think, and act were he in a state of isolation. Le Bon believed that under the pressure of a group, distinctive characteristics of individuals would come to be submerged in a larger group unconscious that tapped into a common human disposition. Freud approvingly quotes Le Bon again. The individual forming part of the group acquires solely from numerical considerations a a sentiment of invincible power, which allows him to yield to instincts which, had he been alone, he would perforce have kept under restraint. He will be the less disposed to check himself from the consideration that a group, being anonymous and in consequence irresponsible, the sentiment of responsibility, which always controls individuals, disappears entirely. End of quote. Freud continues, citing LeBlanc, that a form of contagion arises in groups similar to hypnosis. This group contagion or suggestibility can induce individuals to take actions that they would not necessarily take as individuals. And I think it's important to say here that, and many of us may have experienced this is not something that is exclusive to the right or the left. Group suggestion of this sort can happen in any political context. So Freud agrees with LeBlanc that in groups people regress. They lose touch with their most highly developed thinking capacity and begin to behave more in accordance with primal drives. Spontaneity, violence, ferocity, and also enthusiasm and heroism. He quotes the German poet Schiller, "Everyone, when viewed as an individual, is quite astute and mature. When in a group, they become stupid." And the word there is Dummkopf. Freud adds that a group is more likely to think as young children do, in images rather than in words and concepts, so that agreement with reality is never checked by any reasonable agency. He says the feelings of a group are always very simple and very exaggerated, so that a group knows neither doubt nor uncertainty. So it's easy to see how today social media can reinforce this, since it's a visual world of images in both photos and videos. Freud goes on to set his general pessimism aside momentarily, and he allows that groups can be guided by high ideals, and not only the most animalistic impulses. Quote, "Under the influence of suggestion, groups are also capable of high achievement in the shape of abnegation, unselfishness, and devotion to an ideal." So what is the differentiating factor that makes some groups constructive in their goals and others so destructive? This is where Freud's own contribution went beyond the observations of LeBlanc, which focused mainly on emotional contagion. Freud proposed that the character and aims of a group, whether altruistic or nefarious, also depend heavily on the character and aims of the leader. Freud describes the relationship of followers to a leader as something more than simple admiration. Both idealization and identification are involved. A positive remnant of early identifications remains in the form of what has been taken in as good and idealized. Freud called this internal part of the self the ego ideal, and later it also had some correspondence with the superego. The ego ideal can be a foundation for one's values and the component of the ego related to conscience. For healthy individuals, identification with another person can be an element in forming good relationships. But identification in adulthood, if it is too prominent, can also lead to a regression to a more dependent state of being, as in early childhood, in which the other person's traits, actions, and beliefs are internalized and unconsciously begin to shape and even alter identity. This regressive form of identification is often driven by an unconscious sense of lack and a compulsive need to make up for a loss or deficit in early childhood. And those of you who know the work of Heinz Kohut would recognize that as an area that he developed. Such as a parent's chronic emotional misattunement, unreliability, frequent absence or abandonment, or even outright abuse. So it's precisely this type of regression that Freud sees occurring in groups that become attached to a strong leader. The members of such a group have unconsciously substituted the charismatic figure of the leader for their individual ego ideals. The resulting bond creates both forceful emotional ties among the members of the group, we could say the horizontal ties, and then because they now share a common ego ideal, and a strong bond of loyalty with the leader who is now a part of themselves. Some of Freud's more speculative and we might say outdated notions come into play in his theory here as well, that the leader is a psychological stand-in for the father and his authority. But there are ways in which that still rings true. And since for Freud these strong emotional ties are libidinal, he also sees the attachment to this leader and to other members of the group as fulfilling a deep instinctual wish, disguised in more socially acceptable form. Strongman dictators, including elected authoritarians, which is more of what we're seeing now, frequently use religious symbols and photo ops to cynically intensify the crowd's devotion. Just on May 1st of this year, Trump created a Religious Liberty Commission within the Department of Justice. And when announcing the bombing of Iran in June, he said, "I want to just thank everybody, and in particular God. I just want to say we love you, God, and we love our great military. Protect them. God bless the Middle East, God bless Israel, and God bless America." A statement immediately praised by the religious right. Especially because he said, "We love you, God." One final element in Freud's observations about this type of leader is the element of narcissism. Freud understood that the psychology of individual members of a group and the psychology of the father figure leader were symmetrical but not identical. The individuals still longed for emotional ties with others, but quoting Freud, the father, chief leader, had few libidinal ties. He loved no one but himself, or other people only insofar as they served his needs. Even today, the members of a group stand in need of the illusion that they are equally and justly loved by their leader, but the leader himself need love no one else. He may be of a masterful nature, absolutely narcissistic, self-confident, and independent. And that's Freud writing in 1921. Love, said Freud, puts a check on narcissism and as such is crucial to civilization. But the narcissistic leader loves only himself and exploits the love and devotion of his followers only and always for his own benefit as he sees it, according to his whims. In a recent issue of The Atlantic, George Packer points out that in the current instance of Trump's ascendancy to power, this even transcends the classical virtues of nobility and courage. It's the raw power to humiliate another, whether a person or a country. Zelensky's physical and moral courage, he says, including his refusal to be belittled on camera, enrages Trump, for he's accustomed to endless subservience and flattery. Trump, Packer says, is motivated by, quote, the policies of crude power worship, not realism. They are extensions of Trump's character around the world. Ritualized humiliation is essential to an authoritarian regime. So here we have a form of narcissism that slides over into sociopathic disregard for human life, whether through military aggression or simply the callous withdrawal of essential food and medical aid at home and abroad. These observations square well with the later 20th century efforts to understand totalitarianism, from Hannah Arendt to George Orwell and many others. I want to conclude with one more reference that I recently came upon, which brings together group and social psychology with political science. Right here, University of Chicago law professor Azaz Hook describes a treatise smuggled out of Nazi Germany by a Jewish labor lawyer, Ernst Fraenkel. Fraenkel's thesis was that authoritarianism infiltrates a constitutional, what he called normative state, by gradually creating a parallel zone in which unlimited arbitrariness and violence, unchecked by any legal guarantees. In this domain, which Fraenkel called the prerogative state, ordinary laws don't apply. The leader, quote, acts without regard to the laws on the books. The key here is that this prerogative state does not immediately overrun the normative state. Rather, dictatorships create a lawless zone that runs alongside the normative state. The two states cohabit uneasily and unstably. The trick for the Nazis was to find a way to keep the law going for Christian Germans who supported or at least tolerated the Nazis while ruthlessly executing the Führer's directives against the state's enemies, real and perceived. What I draw from this in relation to Christian nationalism is that Christian-nationalism performs exactly that dual state from within. Although greatly distorted in Christian nationalism and depending on a highly selective set of scripture texts that scarcely follow the teachings of Jesus, the Christian faith most broadly still functions as a normative state where good people come to worship and fellowship. The prerogative state is the infiltration by charismatic church leaders who use Christian rhetoric combined with nationalist fervor to curry the favor of those who will enhance their own power and wealth, the people they perceive as above them in status. These smaller narcissistic leaders thrive on their allegiance to authoritarians in government while feeding off the devotion and fervor of their followers, whose enthusiasm they skillfully whip up and exploit, continually reinforcing an us versus them interpretation of God's will. In the talks I've given on Christian nationalism, I usually make a distinction between leaders whose whole agenda is wealth, personal notoriety, and white power, and their followers. I don't believe it serves us well in opposing authoritarianism to refuse to have compassion for those who have felt abandoned by Democrats and by progressive elites, as they and some of us too would see it. We understand psychologically how fear is so easily exploited and mobilized into hate. And those who would resist authoritarianism and its seductiveness, for many people, including in the US and Europe, we as trained care providers and chaplains have a unique expertise from which to mobilize our commitments to spiritual care, to include improving the conditions under which many of those who turn to MAGA for its false promises have felt burdened and marginalized themselves. We need to offer a compelling and accessible analysis of the ways in which the stigmatized DEI represents a positive development for everyone and not as a threat, as it has been framed by the purveyors of backlash. And at the same time, to mobilize with all the fierceness of love and justice we can muster to oppose the leaders who would bring nothing but destruction and chaos to the vast majority of Americans and others all over the world for their own enrichment and power. We need to identify when and where we can throw a sacred monkey wrench into their schemes of domination, what John Lewis called good trouble. To reiterate, as much as I still believe in one-to-one dialogue, I now believe the current moment calls us most urgently, as people of faith and scholars of religion, to make public witness, to shore up the normative state of Christianity, which is the gospel of love, justice, and healing, and to call out the abuses of the growing threat of authoritarianism, which is already here among us. We need to resist the human temptation toward normalizing lawless and the unspeakable acts by those in power as a way of maintaining our own sense of stability. People of all faiths and none should sound the alarm before religion just becomes another prop for authoritarianism. As the alt-right has gained enormous power since the last election, I believe the balance of our energy needs to shift due to the urgency of the current political situation. I still think the skills we bring as spiritual care providers to have empathic one-on-one conversations is important. But further, the current escalating racist attacks on immigrants and people of color, LGBTQ persons, and the blatant reversal of environmental protections call us to consider spiritual care as resistance. Over 30 years ago, our colleague, Over 30 years ago, Professor Larry Kent Graham called for a psychosystems approach in the discipline of pastoral care, care of persons, care of worlds, encouraging our critiques of neoliberal economics and cultural greed, and toward a post/de-colonial analysis of all our national and societal structures. The scholarly discipline of pastoral theology has certainly responded, but in some ways, insofar as so many of our writings have been academic, our theorizing about practice has mostly remained among ourselves. We've engaged personally in practices of resistance in our own communities, but we perhaps need more collective political and policy-oriented action and more integration of our theoretical writing with listening to others who do not share our privilege to write and to teach, and a resulting grassroots activism. As radical as such calls to action may have seemed among scholars in our field in the late 1980s, it is all the more critical today. Our organization, the IASC, because of our shared commitment to a synergy of religious, cultural, ethnic, and international pluralism, may be especially well poised to take up this charge, since authoritarianism, including duly elected autocratic regimes, is not unique to the United States. Christian nationalism is, of course, a particular concern within Christianity and how it represents a co-optation of Christian symbols and rhetoric for frankly anti-Christian, anti-gospel values and beliefs. The cliche, WWJD, what would Jesus do, may be worth reviving now. Jesus' oft-quoted overturning of the tables of the exploitive moneylenders in the temple was not a temper tantrum, and should certainly not be read as an anti-Semitic story of Jesus, himself a Jew, acting against the Jewish people as a whole. Rather, in my view, a very strategic and performative act of disobedience against corruption and a religious hierarchy that benefited from it. The increasing power of Christian nationalism fused with right-wing politics is surely also of grave concern to persons of all religious traditions, all of whom become more vulnerable when Christian supremacy is fused with white patriarchal hegemony and views of all others as not just different, but dangerous. And all the hate tropes we are familiar with, dirty, grasping, poisoning the blood of our country. As an international and explicitly interreligious organization, we, as members of IASC, have the knowledge and the power collectively to make a more public witness against all that we see is eroding the cultural and religious values that undergird our work of care. Care in this context cannot be separate from advocacy for justice, and I believe we have a mission to bring the work we have shared with one another in clinical and academic venues to a wider public, wherever we are located in the world, to seek out opportunities for public witness, to address the specific local injustices in our teachings and in our care. I want to close with a quotation from the late feminist theologian Beverly Wildman Harrison, whose essay, The Power of Anger in the Works of Love, articulates an ethic of active resistance that is as relevant today as it was during the emergence of feminist theology over 40 years ago. She writes, here's a little quote from my colleague Cornell at Union, "Justice is what love looks like in public. Tenderness is what love feels like in private." So she writes, anger is not the opposite of love. It is better understood as a feeling signal that all is not well in our relation to other persons or groups or to the world around us. Anger is a mode of connectedness to others, and it is always a vivid form of caring. To put the point another way, anger is, and it always is, a sign of some resistance in ourselves to the moral quality of the social relations in which we are immersed. Extreme and intense anger signals a deep reaction to the action upon us or toward others to whom we are related. We must never lose touch with the fact that all serious human moral activity, especially action for social change, takes its bearings from the rising power of human anger. Such anger is a signal that change is called for, that transformation in relation is required. a chief evidence of the grace of God, which always comes to us in, with, and through each other, is this power to struggle and to experience indignation. We should not make light of our power to rage against the dying of the light. It is the root of the power of love. Thank you. Onward.
I, for one, am grateful to have been present for the angriest talk that Pam has ever given. Thank you for that. Thank you for indignation. Thank you for plain spoken, unvarnished truths that are themselves so liberating. I've always found that in your scholarship. I've been reading you for a long time. And I found it especially tonight. So thank you. Thank you for your work. Thank you for the call to care that is also justice making, and for the power of public witness. Thank you. Thank you. I am coveting the opportunity for you all to get to talk about what you have just heard and experienced, and to do that with each other, and to do that maybe with a plate in one hand and a good beverage in the other. There is a reception and some dear folks who have been out there waiting to share the goodness of the earth with you. And so in a minute, after I make sure that Dan doesn't have some last announcements for us, Dan Shabani, do you have last announcements for this group before I dismiss them to the reception? Yes, you do. No, you don't? No? Okay. So here's what I know to tell you. I know to tell you that we really hope, those of you who are joining us tomorrow morning at Catholic Theological Union on Cornell, on that side of Hyde Park, where there's parking. This is the place that hides the parking. That's why they call it Hyde Park. But there's parking at Catholic Theological Union, which is also now the home of Lutheran School of Theology in Chicago and the McCormick Theological Seminary, all of whom are participants and sponsors of this great event. So those of you who are coming to join us tomorrow, come by 9 o'clock, right, Daniel? Is that the right thing to say? Yes. Come and be there by 9. There'll be registration materials for you. There'll be packets for you. There'll be all kinds of instructions for you. Come and join us again tomorrow at 9. But it remains to us now to both thank Daniel for his leadership and thank Pam for this marvelous lecture. Foyer. You can meet each other. Please introduce yourselves to one another and enjoy drinks and food.